The two first songs I remember knowing were Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, and Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. And what I'm going to do this morning is ask Harlan Powell to come. All right, let's hit it, Harlan. Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, green estate in the land of the free, raised in the woods so you knowed every tree, killed him a bar when he was only 3. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Clap with us a little bit. He fought single-handed through the Injun War, till the creeks was whipped and the peace was in store. And while he was handling this risky chore, he made himself a legend forevermore. Davy Crockett, the man who don't know fear. He went off to Congress and served a spell, fixing up the government and laws as well. He took over Washington, so we hear tell, patched up the crack in the Liberty Bell. Davy Crockett, seeing his duty clear. He heard of Houston and Austin and so to the Texas plains. He just had to go where land was free and room to grow, and he needed him at the Alamo. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. You've heard me mention my hero being Davy Crockett and also Daniel Boone. You've heard me say that before. I never really said why. What is it about David Crockett, this man born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, who fought in an Indian war and then went off to Congress and wound up dying at the Alamo? What is it about him that is so intriguing? Well, for me, it is the irony. Part of it is the irony. How many congressmen, United States congressmen, do you know that serve out their term, finally get voted out of office, and then sign up for a militia, go off to war and get themselves killed? It's an odd thing. At least in our world, it's an odd thing. And it almost seems like a waste that David Crockett would go to the Alamo and hold up there in the Alamo with 180-something Texicans and stay there and stay there and stay there, even though they knew this massive army was coming their way. General Santa Anna, with thousands of men, came and surrounded the Alamo. When it was about to happen, Colonel Travis, who was in command, realized anybody who stays here is going to die. And so with his army saber, he drew a line in the sand. And he said, if you want to stay, step over the line. And I'm told and I read that all but maybe one person stepped over the line. The Honorable David Crockett stepped over the line. And in stepping over the line, you realized you were volunteering to die. You were making a sacrifice. But there was a purpose to this sacrifice. Because you see, as Santa Anna was moving swiftly through Texas, headed east, General Sam Houston, over in extreme East Texas, was going 90-0, working as hard as he could to put a big army together. to get them trained, get them ready to face that army of Santa Anna. Santa Anna called himself the Napoleon of the West. Very arrogant man, a proud man. And the Texans were really not a match, but General Houston needed time. If somebody didn't occupy him and hold him off for at least 2 or 3 weeks, there was no hope. He was going to sweep through all of Texas, take over everything, and today there would be no Arkansas-Texas Longhorn ball game. Because history would have gone a completely different way. There'd be no Texas. It would just be part of Mexico. And by the way, New Mexico and Arizona and California possibly would as well. But Davy and his men realized the only hope for freedom, the only way Texas is going to be a free country is for us to die. Get that. See if you can get your mind around that. We are going to die. We're going to lose this battle, but it's not really a loss. It's going to be a victory. Because even though we lose this battle, it's going to give our nation, our people, a chance to win the war. And so, 185 men stepped over the line. And sure enough, they fought it off as hard as they could. Santa Anna sent an officer to tell Travis to surrender. Travis answered with a shell and a rousing rebel yell. And Santa Anna turned scarlet. And he said, I'll put every one to the sword. Now, there are all different accounts of who died where and how. About the only thing I do know for sure, reading historical accounts, is that David Crockett probably did not die up on the top of the fort swinging his rifle as the last man there. But he was one of the last, according to eyewitnesses. Susanna Dickinson, wife of Captain Dickinson, she said later that she saw Davy standing up against a wall with 6 of his men, and there was a pile of dead Mexican soldiers all around him, out of powder, fighting now with a knife, completely surrounded, swooped in, forced surrender, and Davy and his men were hacked to death against the walls. Terrible way to go. And yet he chose it. It was not an accident. He knew it was coming, but he did it anyway. That Davy, he's a hard fella to figure out. But he had this saying, David Crockett did. Always be sure you're right, then go ahead. Always be sure you're right, go ahead. Well, he was sure he was right. And so he went ahead, knowing that meant he'd soon be dead. Jesus Christ was also a hard fella to figure. Now, I don't know that Jesus ever killed a bar when he was only 3. And he never fought in an Indian war. But he did some more impressive stuff than that. Jesus Christ once woke up in the bottom of a boat in the middle of a giant storm, and all the men around him were screaming, Lord, help us, help us. We're perishing. And Jesus arose and he rebuked the wind, and suddenly there was a great calm. He said, peace, be still. And on another occasion, Jesus walked to the tomb of a dead man, a man named Lazarus who'd been dead for 4 days. Jesus said, roll away the stone. They said, no, Lord, by now he'll be stinking. That's in the Bible. He'll be stinking. Jesus said, roll it away. And they rolled it away. And Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come forth. And the Bible says that he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot. And Jesus said, loose him and let him go. A dead man came walking out of the tomb. Pretty impressive stuff. But as strange as it was for a congressman to go volunteer and get himself killed, Jesus did something stranger. He voluntarily surrendered to the will of God, which meant he was going to walk up a hill called Calvary, shouldering an old rugged cross. And when he got to the top of the hill, evil men who did not know just how much evil they were doing drove spikes into his hands, into his feet, and hung him up to die. Jesus knew that was coming. He'd been prophesying it for months, perhaps even over a year. He knew that he was going to die. He said, no man takes my life from me. I lay it down voluntarily. If I lay it down, I can take it up again. Jesus was determined to teach us an extremely important truth about life, about God, about how the spiritual world works. The truth is this: if you seek to save your life, you will lose it. But if you lay it down voluntarily for my sake, you'll take it up again. By the way, that makes me think of Davy's story over here. Do you know one of the things that made David Crockett a legend forevermore is not that he fought in an engine war, not that he was a congressman. Do you remember any other congressman from the 1830s? No. It's that this congressman went and voluntarily sacrificed his life. And now, he laid down his life, but now his legend is still alive and influencing people. It's influencing you right now. Similar thing with Jesus. You know, Jesus did not, obviously he didn't have to go to the cross, but he didn't even have to go to Jerusalem in the first place. Before Jesus went into Jerusalem, he told his disciples, I'm going to be killed there. I'm going to be offered up. I'm going to be betrayed into the hands of sinful men. And the disciples were saying things like, Jesus, stop talking like that. Let's just don't go. He said, no, we're going. And even on the night before he was arrested, there in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying until he sweat great drops of blood. Talk about stress. Stress. And the stress and the struggle was, do I lay my life down as I've taught others to do? Or do I try to save it? He could have saved it so easily. Why not just slip out of that garden and disappear into the hills of Judea? Why keep waiting there until the soldiers arrived? It's because he went through this struggle. His own will, his Father's will. His will for self-preservation, which is natural to all of us. All of us are really naturally, the natural man is all about self-preservation, self-protection. And Jesus had to overcome that because he realized this was God's will for him. And he said, nevertheless, even though it's not my will, let thy will be done. And that's what set up his death. Jesus surrendered to death. But there's something about surrender and death that we need to get really, really clear about. We think of surrender as a sign of weakness. We consider surrender to be what you do when you're just whipped and you got no other choice but to give up. And that is a form of surrender. But that's forced surrender. And there's no particular honor in forced surrender. What's honorable is when you do what David Crockett did, when you do what Jesus Christ did. I would not have to do this, but I surrender to it. I give my life up. I forget about all my needs for self-preservation and self-protection. I lay down my life trusting that if I let go of the things that are valuable to me, God can be trusted to raise them up again. See, if there'd been no death, there could have been no resurrection. And if there'd been no resurrection, there'd be no hope for me or for you or anybody else. But Jesus showed us a pattern that we've got to learn. There are times in life when you will find yourself in some situation and you ask God to get you out of it. Just as Jesus prayed, Father, I wish this could go some other way. And yet God, somehow or another, through circumstances, through a sermon, through words from a friend, a Bible verse you happen upon, God gives you this sense of assurance that the suffering you're about to endure is not going to be a wasted suffering. This is going to be a sacrifice that counts for something more. This is going to be one of those cases where you surrender and lose a battle so that you can rise up and win the war. Which is exactly what happened in the case of David Crockett, Jim Bowie, William Barrett Travis, Captain Dickinson, as they were fighting it out at the Alamo, with barely enough ammunition left for a turkey shoot back home. They kept fighting until they were out of ammo, and they did swing their rifles, sticks, anything they had. While they were doing that, Sam Houston was forming his army. And by the time Sam Houston's army met the Napoleon of the West at the Battle of San Jacinto, Houston was ready. It was a monstrous victory for the Texans. The battle lasted only 10 minutes. Santa Anna himself was captured. And with the stroke of his pen, he signed away the entire state of Texas. Do you see the pattern? Somebody had to surrender their life in order to win on a much larger scale and in a much bigger way. What area of your life is it right now where you've got something you're up against that you can't change? You look at those things you can change and you do everything you can to change them, and yet there's this other thing you can't change. And you got to decide, am I just going to say, if God won't deliver me from that, if he won't listen to my prayers to get me out of that, so much for him. Adios. And run away from God. That's what a whole lot of people do when they find themselves hurting and they ask for relief and none comes and they don't understand why, they assume let me say it this way. Because they don't see a reason, they make the mistake of assuming there's not a reason. And there always is. And it's usually one you will not see until later. There are some things we can look back on after 10 years or after 25 years and understand why. And yet there are other hurts so painful that it'll only be an eternity when we find ourselves in the uninterrupted presence of God, uninterrupted, unblocked access to God. And as Paul said, we're able to see what God has seen all along. We're able to understand what he was up to. But there's a time when what you got to do is just really trust. To surrender means to trust. Only a person who trusts God fully with the outcome really can surrender and say, not my will, but thine be done. I'm giving up control. I don't have it anyway. I trust you. Will you do that? Or will you just reject God and Christ and run away like David could have done from the Alamo? What I'm talking about here goes against human nature. It also goes against normal everyday logic. Because as I said earlier, logic, everyday thinking is about self-preservation. And it doesn't make sense to a person who doesn't have a spiritual sensitivity or a spiritual life, a spiritual understanding of how things work. It makes no sense, which is why Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, for the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The word of the cross, to them who are perishing, that is, to those who've given up, those who've rejected Christ for any number of reasons, for those people, this whole idea of the cross, that if I give up, if I surrender, I'm going to win somehow, that's the message. It seems foolish to the natural mind. But once you get it, once you really grasp the power of the cross, then you're able to take all of your crosses and do with them what Jesus did with his. You surrender. And though you may die, the thing you have to let go of dies. But after every death, the New Testament says a resurrection is coming. And there was a resurrection coming for Jesus Christ. But it wouldn't have happened if he had not surrendered to death in the first place. And so what I really need to ask you is this. The cross of Christ, accepting Christ and receiving him, is to follow in his footsteps. Yes, it does involve believing. Of course, it involves believing that Jesus died on the cross and surrendered his life and then took it up again. Of course, you got to believe that, because if you don't believe that, you won't know how to apply the principle. The problem is, most of us just think the belief itself is all there is. No, you got to believe it so that you can practice it in your own life. Every one of us in this room, sooner or later, you are going to run up against something you can't fix. And when you do, you're going to think it is the most God-forsaken thing imaginable. And the irony is, it is the very thing God sent into your life to teach you how to surrender, to teach you the way of the cross. Nobody ever takes the way of the cross simply because they think, oh, that looks like fun. No, the way of the cross is really understood by people who take that way and surrender. And so my question to you is, what are you going to do with Jesus Christ? You know, a lot of us accepted Christ when we were children. We had no idea what we were getting into. I mean that in a good way. But I also know that we had no idea what trials lay before us or the growth that was going to come through those trials. It's probably good that I didn't know it all. That's the way God engineers it. You made that decision to follow him a long time ago, and I'm glad you did. But when you find yourself bearing a cross, you got to decide, am I going to keep following him? Am I going to follow him in this situation? What will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus? Will you follow his pattern? Or will you just run away from him and try to hang on to, for dear life, to all these things in the world you don't want to let go of until finally you breathe your last breath and give up? Surrender to Christ. Surrender to God. Even when God comes to you disguised as reality. Last word. You got to decide what to do with the cross. So, be sure you're right and go ahead. Go ahead and make the recommitment that needs to be made. Go ahead and receive Christ for the first time, because we got to start somewhere. You can't complete a journey that you don't begin. You must receive Christ, believe on him, be baptized, and begin to walk the Christian faith in your daily life. That's the step some people need to take because they've not done it. And you will not get to heaven unless you receive him and take that journey with him. Others are beside the road. We've been traveling with Jesus a long time, but not long, but some time back, we got hit head on and we're over in the ditch. And Christ comes to you today and holds out a hand and say, hey now. Hey, Bubba. Hey, darling. I know you're hurt, but we've got a little ways more further to go. Come on, child. Come on. And you need to get up and you need to go with him. And only if you go with him will you arrive at the place he wants to take you.